thank you very much for that warm introduction, and let me get my screen sharing started here. I, I agree with you that our ability to meet and share ideas across the globe like this is really a silver lining of really what has been quite a bit of suffering from the pandemic. And I think the first thing I always want to say as I start a talk is thank you. I admire anyone who seeks to expand their thinking during this time, and it's very validating for the work that I do in order to try to push the boundaries of insights and market research and the type of consulting we do against those. So I think for the next few minutes, what I'd like to do is talk to you about some challenges that we faced at Microsoft, particularly regarding building a really strong brand. And that is actually even building a stronger brand than I inherited, and that we inherited, coming into this. And in order to get there, we really had to think differently. And I think that, by the end of this talk, what I hope you see is that sometimes getting the people we consult with our research findings, with our insights, sometimes the most important thing that we can do for them is to give them the courage to act. And data has that ability, perhaps more than anything else that we can think of. So let me tell you a little bit about this journey that I've been on. Well, in many ways, my background in psychology has always been a great help to me as I've been, over the course of my career, as much of a user researcher as I have been a market researcher. And some time ago, actually in 2017, I published a book, which I've been teaching at the University of Washington, really about the psychology of designing, great products in tech. And it kind of goes a little bit beyond designing them and beyond UX to CX in general, and ultimately to building strong brands. But, many of us have heard repeatedly throughout our careers that it's getting customers' attention that is the most important moment of truth in trying to be successful at marketing. And then others, maybe who work closer to products, understand that motivation and keeping people engaged with our apps and with our services is a fundamental goal. So those two moments of truth or challenges that you faced with human neurology are pretty well known to people. But part of the reason that I wrote this book was to say that's not the only two. Humans really are built to filter, in the sense that we perceive, what are designs that are brought to us very instantaneously as either being useful or noise. There are bottlenecks of memory, and I'm going to talk a lot about that tonight, in terms of, so much of what we do to help our customers achieve their goals, so much of our design to eliminate a little bit of friction. A lot of it is not necessarily encoded into long-term memory in a way that can affect the brand. And then there's other very strong moments of truth, including, self-image. Do people really see that your tech offering, anything from Microsoft Office to Microsoft Azure, they're really asking themselves, is it for me? And that's as strong a bottleneck as attention and motivation everywhere. And then finally, social influence, something I think us market researchers know a little bit about. Anytime we ask the question, would you recommend this or that product? So with that kind of, orientation that I take into my work, this is what I was faced with as a goal last year. And Microsoft is fortunate to occupy a privileged position globally with the strength of our brand. I think we actually have recently moved from the 4th position to the 3rd with Interbrand's annual assessment of the world's strongest brands. But what was more interesting to me is an Interbrand study that took a slightly different lens on things. And they were ranking brands by their best customer experiences. And in that one, on the right side of this slide, you can see that, we were further back in the pack and there was more work to do. So this is the kind of thing where, we should see and rise to that challenge. We should learn from strong brands that maybe aren't normally on our radar, like the ones you see on this list, Disney and Hilton at the top of that list. And, I started to ask myself, what are those brands doing that Microsoft is not? What really, in the end, is a world-class customer experience? And really, when I started to think about the role that memory plays, I was remembering something that Daniel Kahneman taught us in his wonderful 2011 book, Thinking Fast and Slow. And really, I mean, this is such a big thought. It affects everything about our lives and parenting and vacationing and education and our careers and so forth. And basically what Kahneman talked about is we have a very strong bias in our memory where most of our experiences are not encoded for long-term recall. Most of them are completely forgotten. And the few snippets, that are remembered really have to do with the peak moments, the pit moments, and the endings. And over the course of his career, Kahneman realized that that's actually condensed storytelling. What we remember about our experiences is the tension, the resolution, how it ended, and so forth. But in the end, when you ask someone to say, how much do you esteem a particular brand? They are really only accessing a very, very small number of their customer experiences in order to make that judgment, in order, as Kahneman says here, to keep score and decide how was it on the whole. And so really, other theorists have worked with this idea, including Dan Heath and Chip Heath wrote a lovely book called The Power of Moments, to draw the conclusion that if you want to create better customer experiences, you have to create better moments. You have to ask yourself, is the work we're doing actually going to be remembered? And I think something about this, again, with Kahneman is just a very profound sort of perspective on our lives. When you think about your last vacation, you probably will not recall the moment to moment, the renting the car, the awkwardness and so forth. What you'll recall are peaks and pits and how it ended. When you think back, on parenting, on your education, when your children think back on your own parenting. So it's quite far-reaching. But when you pull it into running a great company, you actually have to face the challenge that much of what maybe our developers do with their roadmap, much of what we wring our hands and worry so much about with eliminating a little bit of load time or friction in our products will not actually be encoded in memory by our customers. And therefore, much of that work to, again, be frictionless will not ultimately elevate perceptions of our brand. And I think that challenge that Kahneman's idea presents us is something that we should talk and debate more about. And it really, in the end, is a little bit along the lines of, is what we're doing what really matters, right? So, Chip and Dan Heath talked quite a bit about this and really, brought attention to the question of how does this affect brands. The other thing that they did in their book was talk about the 4 key emotions on the part of customers that they have during experience that do then lead to a memory, these emotions are really what innervates our decision to say, okay, I'll remember that for later. In another way, this is what designing peak moments is about. Can you, in your customers, arouse these emotions? And they are elevation, and that's just when someone has a sensory experience, maybe something that's surprising, breaks the script, kind of funny. They could be moments of pride. Certainly, when those moments happen, we remember them. They could be moments of insight where our customers feel, oh, I'm able to solve a problem I've had for a long time. Those sort of, aha moments. And finally, moments of connection with other people, or connection with the brand, or connection with the employees at the brand. And so we started to kind of encourage, and we were doing a lot of work with teams for much of this research. We started to encourage us to look at our design ideas and say, are we arousing these emotions? And one of the one on the far left here, this was an interesting, it was really just a garage prototype. But this coder working on Teams said, hey, at the end of a meeting, I have this funny add-in where you can run the credits for the meeting as though the meeting were a movie. Who directed this meeting? Who was the visual effects supervisor? It's a humorous, script flipping sort of surprise, but it's just the kind of thing that actually could create a moment. Now that's a little gimmicky, but others are a little bit better. We, we used Microsoft Teams to bring people to basketball games at the NBA during the pandemic. But we also used that in order to invite people who worked at our national elections, the poll workers. And if they're invited to watch an NBA game with NBA stars and former presidents, that's definitely a moment of pride, right? And they can brag about that later. Or insights or connection. On the far right here, one of the very good example of thinking and designing for peak moments was together mode in Teams. And that's where, there's a virtual reality environment where we bring in our video feeds and we just feel a little bit more connected. We could be all put together in a classroom setting or, at a concert or even on a roller coaster in some of the ideas that we're seeing. So this was the kind of ideas we wanted to encourage because, whatever you did to become the third best brand globally, you're going to have to do something different to become the best and to beat out competitors like Amazon, like Apple, like Disney in those lists. So this is sort of a summary of just this part of the talk, the theory here. Brand perceptions have always been driven more by customers' usage of products than by ad campaigns. You can advertise your way to a decently strong brand, but you can't get all of the way there without amazing customer experience, right? So, you have to ask yourself, will your roadmap improve brand perceptions? When you strive only to be frictionless, you'll be mostly forgettable, and only the pit moments in the user experience will be remembered. So companies need the courage to develop delightfully indelible peak moments as well. And that's where research is really needed in order to create those kind of ideas and create the kind of courage to go forward with that. So that's why I developed the research that I'm going to tell you about here. And it started with a good question. We needed to understand what were people's most vivid memories involving brands. And so really, I developed a battery that started with an open end. I wanted to know if you were just to ask, what is your most vivid memory about Zoom? What is your most vivid memory about MRSI? What would people say? What is the thing that sticks with them? Because whatever sticks with them is what they can talk about to other people. It's also what they think about as they're answering whether or not they're satisfied. So I wanted to know what those were. And we were making strides with processing text-based responses using AI. And so I knew that we would be able to handle this. But I went ahead and asked people, okay, after you've told us your story of your most vivid moment, positive or negative, now rate for me whether or not you felt that was positive or negative, and did it affect your view of the brand as a whole? This was very important. We all know with advertising research that sometimes an ad is strongly attributed to the brand and sometimes it's not. Well, the same thing is true with memories. You could have a very positive memory, but it may or may not be strongly tied to or attributed to or affect your view of the brand as a whole. And so we needed to know that. So this was the question that we developed. And the first thing that we started doing is using a scoring formula that combined both how positive it was and how much it affected your view of the brand as a whole. We were then able to really just get a distribution of whether or not most of people's memories were peak moments or pit moments or something in between. Now, when people told us, I don't really actually have a vivid memory, that's a valid data point. And that's what you see in the dark gray segment of these stacked bar graphs here. We see that as a huge opportunity. If there's a lot of people who say, you asked me what my most vivid memory of Microsoft Teams is, well, I don't really have one. We need to know that number because there's an opportunity to turn that into a positive memory. But with these, you can now start to compare across segments. You can compare to competitors. You can watch these stacked bar graphs change over time. It's another brand metric that we feel that we really didn't have in our brand tracking before. The next thing we did was correlational research. We started to divide people by how they answered. Did they report a peak moment? Those people are here in green. Did they report a pit moment? They're in red. And then we would ask them other questions, like in this case, how much do you love the brand? And you could ask anything. How much would you recommend it? Would you consider it for purchase, right? And what we found is that this grouping of people accounted for a very strong difference in variance in brand love. The people who reported a peak moment were far more likely, nearly half, to say that they loved the team's brand, strongly agree. Whereas almost no one who reported a pit moment would say so. Getting brand love is a goal of ours at Microsoft that we work very hard at. So knowing that we could see or predict by a certain moment or memory on the part of our customers to elevate brand love was a very actionable finding that my stakeholders worked with. Well, the next thing, and this is where we were able to match answers to that question with some of the telemetry that we have on some of our customers, those who opt in for our panels. We have a large database of consumers who opt in to our database, where we can understand their usage across a variety of products, but we can also understand their spending. And all of a sudden here, the same pattern emerged. Those who reported a peak moment, when just asked, what's your most vivid memory? They were spending more across our consumer portfolio than people who reported a neutral emotional memory. They were spending 23% more on a monthly basis. And those people who were reporting neutral memories were spending 29% more than the people with pit moments. Well, once you see divisions in people spending like that, now you know that if you start designing for more peak moments, you're going to get an ROI. You are going to get a return from that. In fact, just by virtue of the fact that there are far more people with neutral memories than with pit memories, you stand to gain a 6 times larger addressable revenue opportunity by moving people who have a neutral memory to peaks than by eliminating the remaining pits and moving them to a neutral memory. There's more to be gained financially by designing peak moments than by eliminating the remaining pit moments. So this is the kind of data we needed to give people that courage to design things like Together Mode and the NBA tie-in. Now, I know if I was listening to this talk as a thoughtful researcher and insights person, I would be wondering about causality here. Which comes first, increased spending, increased usage, brand love, or the memory? And so I, of course, wanted to know the same answer myself. So what we did was some time series analysis. And I've done this both with our consumers. I've also done it with information workers. And so what you're looking at here is just a very, I had to strip the data, but it's a very untouched, line graph of what the people were spending before they had this peak in this pit moment. And so we were able to look at their spending for, a good 12 months before they reported this moment happening. And then we were able to look at their spending afterward. And you can see that the two populations were almost the same. They were quite braided in their spending before that moment happened. But afterward, that propensity for people with peak moments to be spending more was consistent and at times quite pronounced. Now, all of you see the spike at the end of this particular analysis. Well, this is the spike that happened when COVID first hit. You see it's about April 2020. Well, at that time, everybody went out and they bought more laptops and more Office subscriptions. They got on Teams. They bought more Xbox subscriptions. And so everybody was spending more in that month in our consumer populations. But you see that the people who had previously had a peak moment, they were spiking far higher than the people who had had a pit moment. So this was some of our best causal data that this really was a propensity for people to spend more. This is a similar graph, and I promised you, that I also had done this research on commercial knowledge workers, what we call information workers. And here we weren't tracking their spending because it's their employers who spend on things like Teams, but we were tracking their usage. And the effect is a little bit more subtle, but you can certainly see it from the left side of the graph to the right side, is that after that peak moment or pit moment occurs, or your memory is fairly neutral, you see that those populations tend to fan out, where the information workers with peak moments were using the team's product more each month than the people with pit moments. So once again, we got another sort of corroboration that there was a causal influence here. So the good news is that by talking about this with the teams group and really helping them understand, it's important if we're going to compete with Zoom, which we're all on right now, that we really do need to design these moments. We also need to continue eliminating all pit moments. It's very important for me to say that this isn't an either or proposition, but most companies, including our own, focus too heavily on eliminating bugs, eliminating pit moments, getting rid of friction, helping our customers seamlessly achieve their goals and say, it just works. And I think what the provocation here is that you could maximize your fluency there. And all of us can think of brands that are just usable and seamless and frictionless that way. But I still contend that they haven't actually gotten the brand love, the resistance to competitors, the loyalty, the advocacy, where you actually talk about it to other people necessarily, than those brands who also design moments and bring that out in their brand story. So last couple of slides here, and then I'll happy to field some questions. But what's your takeaway from this? Well, the first is, think about measuring your customers' reactions to a brand more with a memory lens. Ask them the question, what is your most vivid memory? And you could adapt that in any way you wanted to. Ask it about their customer journey. Ask it about their onboarding process. And think very carefully about what their answer is, because that answer, what their most vivid memory is going to contain the peak moments and the pit moments that they're really evaluating you on. So review the data is really the first thing. And then take a look at your roadmap and challenge your engineering to say, let's go down your roadmap. What do you got? What do you got that you're going to go to market with here in the next quarter, in the next half? And just sort of start asking yourself through this lens, are any of these going to be remembered? Are any of these moments where we create those emotions of elevation, pride, insight, connection? Or is all of this just removing a little bit more friction, which is good, but not necessarily going to create that brand love? So evaluate your roadmap and ask yourself, is there anything in here that's really going to be a memory? And then you can sit down and you can brainstorm peak moments. You can ask yourself, well, what could we build? How might we? In that wonderful question that designers always ask themselves, how might we make our customers feel more of these emotions of elevation or pride or insight or connection? And then finally, do the data, combine survey data with your back-end telemetry or big data, because you'll be able to do what I did here, which is you'll find that there is an ROI. There is increased adoption. There is increased engagement and increased spending. And I really did love this quote by Heath and Heath in The Power of Moments, which was, to create fans, you need the remarkable, and that requires peaks. But peaks don't emerge naturally. They must be built. And so the last thing I'll say, and I'm looking closely at the time here, the last thing I'll say is to acknowledge something maybe you're thinking. Some peak moments in our customers' lifetimes with our brands are not anything that we can engineer. For instance, on Zoom, right? You may have had a birthday party with a loved one that you couldn't see because of the pandemic. Well, that's not exactly something engineering or marketing can come out with. The same thing's happening on Teams. On Teams, a lot of people are saying, when we ask this question, Teams help keep our business alive during the pandemic. Well, these aren't things you can really engineer. And so a new idea that sort of comes from this, and this is where, I'm kind of sticking my neck out, trying to be innovative and creative here, is the idea of, well, if you can't create these moments, you might still be able to commemorate them, to reach out to your customers whom had an important moment, and say, hey, congratulations, we celebrate this. You know, from every one of us here at Microsoft. And on the right side, I started working with LinkedIn because they actually are doing something very similar. They reach out to the top voices in their network, you know, the influencers on LinkedIn who have incredible reach and influence with a lot of other people. And they send them a commemorative, high touch sort of congratulations from the brand. Now, this kind of thing really works in many ways. The first is that it's a moment of pride that people have, and they themselves will definitely remember this for a long time about the brand. But in order to get your scale, what you find is the first thing most people do when they get you know, a very proud thank you card from the brand itself is they go talk about it on social media. And that's how you can actually get your scale from this. And this in some ways is just a very human, high touch connection with our customers that they can then go on and represent in a very authentic way, you know, around the web. So I wanted the psychology and thinking about memory here to get to this point where we could not only encourage new ways of thinking, but also innovate ourselves with our measurement and with our consulting. So let me end it here. I think, and I really love it in the introduction. You read this very quote, which I think is exactly what I want to leave you with after this talk. So if anyone has questions, I'd be delighted to hear from them. And thank you so much for having me and for listening. I see one question, and I can't quite hear you yet. So I do see, and yeah. Can you hear me? Because I'm sorry, at this point, I can't hear you. Yeah, you're good. I do see one question in the Q&A that let me address because it's a good one. There were, when you ask people, what's your most vivid memory? Some people, you know, would say, I have none. And some people say, I have a memory, but then they score it as fairly neutral. And, you know, should you combine those? And I think that the answer is, well, we actually tested this specifically, and you'll see a lot of times that the people with a neutral memory or no memory have similar levels of brand love and similar levels of spending. So in some of those correlative, predictive ways, they're quite similar. Now, I see that you've also spotted in my graph the specific memories. These are the ones that might be positive, but they may not reveal to that customer something about the brand. Let me give you an example. Like right now, actually, is a pretty good example. We're having a little bit of a sound difficulty. And, you know, I don't know, we might remember it, we might forget it. But the question is, are we blaming this on Zoom, right? And if people say, no, I'm not, then this is not the kind of customer experience that will be a peak or a pit moment. It has to be both, you know, kind of extreme, but it also has to be attributed to the brand. And if you start to think about it, you'll see many, many examples out there. If I'm delayed on an airline flight, I might remember it, but I might not blame the airline, right? And another very interesting example came with LinkedIn. On LinkedIn, there was a lot of people who had a very positive memory, and that was they got a job through LinkedIn. But what we learned in working with them is they didn't necessarily credit LinkedIn for that event. And so just like in an ad where we're like, we need to work on brand attribution, you also find you sometimes need to work on that in customer experience design. Other questions? Okay. Okay. Hey, I think it's a good place to end there. I'd like to make sure after this, we share the ESOMAR paper if people want to learn more and dig in. I'll hang on a second. I really hope that that isn't on my side.